Welcome to the CatNIP Show, a video show that brings you stories and interviews at the intersection of technology, culture and play. I am your host, Jyoti Patel, principal of Spill LLC, where we create playful workshop experiences to disrupt the status quo.
This week, what is culture and cultural angst? And more importantly, how do we as leaders tackle it?
Welcome to episode 3 of the CatNIP Show. Today's topic is culture, and more specifically, the concept of cultural angst. So on this show, we talk a lot about culture. And first, I'd like to start out by defining it for you. So I've been reading this book, Sapiens, by Yuval Noah Harari. And if you haven't read it, it's an excellent book. I highly suggest you check it out. But his definition of culture in this book is the imagined constructs that sustain the social order. And I love this concept. He goes on to elaborate myths and fictions that accustom people nearly from the moment of birth to think in certain ways, to behave in accordance with certain standards, to want certain things, and to observe certain rules. He ends with, these are instincts that enabled millions of strangers to cooperate effectively. And I like the concept of the myths and fictions, or the stories that we tell one another, as being the definition of culture. I'd like to extend that out a little bit further and share with you a definition from the Business Dictionary. And this is a definition for organizational culture. Organizational culture includes an organization's expectations, experiences, philosophy, as well as the values that guide member behavior. And so the nuggets I want to pull out from these definitions are that culture is not just a set of beliefs and values that are invisible, only in our minds, but culture, these values and mindsets guide our behavior. They guide the stories that we tell each other, and they guide our actions and how we plan for the future. So there's this definition of culture that's both invisible and visible. And I think that that's an interesting thing to take note of. So what's this concept of cultural angst? So I came up with this term, and for me, it's this tension that exists within us when there's a conflict between different cultural ideologies. And for me, the word angst was really appropriate because it brings about ideas or memories of being a teenager and this internal conflict that exists within so many of us during our teenage years. And where does that come from? There's the values that our parents are teaching us, the values of career and academic success, of stability, of safety. And then there's the additional values that are so important to us as we're emerging into the world as adults, of sexual freedom, of rebellion, of independence. And these so often are in conflict with the values that our parents are teaching us. And so often teenagers just struggle to find a way to reconcile stability with experimentation. And I know I did. So for me, I grew up in the UK to first generation Indian immigrants from East Africa. And I personally experienced a lot of cultural angst that came from the clash of the various cultures that I was exposed to, primarily Indian and British. Some of the ways that this showed up were in religious, cultural ideologies, music, but some of the ones that stand out the most are the family cultures and the feminist, or the role of the female within society, that cultural component too. And, thinking back from a family perspective, in India and in many Asian cultures, some of you may relate to this, there is an element of always family first. Family comes first. And I think in a lot of Western cultures, there's more of a focus on the individual and individual freedom and putting friends first if you want to, being able to choose who you spend time with. And so that was definitely a source of angst for me growing up. I always wondered why I wasn't allowed to go out as much or do as much as my peers, as my friends. And then in the same vein, we have the role of the female and how, depending on which gender you're born into, there's an expectation around how you behave in terms of compliance, in terms of the type of role that you play in your family or in your home with respect to housework, being a breadwinner, all sorts of things, cooking. And I like to think of my experience, even though it was anxiety-inducing as a teenager and brought about a lot of confusion for me, now that I'm older, I get to look back on that experience with a lot more perspective and understand that now, today, I've been able to select the cultural values and philosophies that I resonate with the most. And I get to bring the best of both worlds into my life. And I think it takes hindsight to be able to see some of those benefits, especially when sometimes that angst can be quite stressful. It's hard to see the forest for the trees in the middle of those types of experiences. So that's kind of where this concept of cultural angst came from. So I'd like to then move this concept into the organization or into organizational culture. So during my time working at the largest aerospace company in the world, there was a lot of cultural angst going on there as well. And this tension that existed between, I'll call them aspirational values or beliefs, and also of beliefs or values that are current reality. And sometimes they don't always align. So I'll give you an example. So I so often had many opportunities to work in a large airplane manufacturing factory facility. And walking through the factory, I'll never forget this feeling of amazement and wonder at how efficient we were, at how lean we were, and just how well-versed we were with innovation and what that looked like in a manufacturing environment. And so we were. The guiding values there were innovation and performance and efficiency. And then a couple days later, I would be at my desk managing a workflow through different groups and getting very frustrated at the inefficiencies in how work flowed through different teams. And it so often felt cumbersome and bureaucratic, and we were so often constrained by our tools or processes that were difficult or near impossible to change. So then the values or the norms were inefficiency and bureaucracy and being slow. And these two very different ideologies or cultural frameworks caused a lot of, I think, internal conflict, not just for me, but for other people in the organization. And I think that's something that a lot of people experience in today's organizations. Another example are the values of people first. People are our most valuable asset. You know, we spend a lot of money in our organizations on employee engagement surveys and initiatives to make people feel valued and gather their opinions and really include people in defining the strategy of our organizations. So this concept of people first. And then in conflict with that, there's the environments where we have to lay people off or compete with one another for credit or for advancement opportunities. And those two are in conflict with one another, which especially resulted in a lot of cultural angst. So I experienced this during my corporate career, and I think it's something that's really happening a lot. So I live in Seattle, and a lot of the tech companies in Seattle offer really great benefits. There's unlimited food and drinks and happy hour with fresh home-brewed kegs or craft-brewed kegs. Unlimited vacation are some of the benefits that you'll hear about at tech companies. And then in the same vein, people oftentimes are at work for 12 hours. The food and the constant nourishment is a way of keeping people at work longer to make them work harder and get more from people. The notion of unlimited vacation, I've heard from so many of my friends in tech companies that, yes, we on paper get unlimited vacation, but I could never take that. And there's always a limit to how much time I can take off. It's the unwritten rules that guide people's behaviors. So I think that too results in a lot of cultural angst for employees at tech companies, where we say we value people, we say we have really great benefits, but then people do feel very overworked and sometimes undervalued through these benefits being just merely spoken and not actual values that guide behavior. So I hope that kind of paints a picture for you on where some of that conflict or angst may emerge. And I think that this concept is a really interesting one for us to dive into as we start to think about how cultural angst may exist within our organizations and teams. And then more importantly, what do we do about it? So for me, a lot of the answers lie with leadership. And when I say leadership, I don't just mean managers, I mean leaders at all levels, folks who help change and shift the direction of our culture. And I think leaders play a huge role in starting to reconcile this angst. So for me, there's this innate element of human nature that humans always move to creating what is called an us versus them mentality. I observed this a lot during my corporate career. There's a natural human tendency to group yourselves into communities and differentiate yourself against other groups. And I've observed this a lot between employees at the working level and senior management. There's always us at the working level and them, senior management. They don't get us. They don't understand what we're doing or care about us or where we come from. And so I think the role of leadership is to help kind of push up against this us versus them mentality. So back to the angst. What do we do about it? What do leaders do about it? I think the very first step is to name it. So many of these cultural components and elements and values exist below the waterline. They're invisible. And so our first role as leaders is to be radically candid about how we talk about these issues. Let's talk about the fact that, yes, we do value people first. However, our current business environment demands that we make cuts or become more efficient and do what's necessary to keep the business alive for the greater good. And so often, I think it takes a level of vulnerability in admitting that our values are in conflict, that sometimes we have to make decisions that don't line up with our core values for the greater good or for a bigger goal. And it's really important to name these things, to talk about them openly, and to take them from the invisible to the visible. Another thing is, the second thing is defining a path through this cultural angst. How do we move through it? How do we identify how we move through this situation? And I think a lot of it is from taking it being, wrong card, taking it from being this concept of cultural angst, this conflict that exists within each of us. This has a kind of negative connotation, right? Take it from being cultural angst to dynamic tension. So dynamic tension is a term that is from Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline, another excellent book I would recommend. And I don't have the official definition, but I'll try to just paraphrase. Dynamic tension is the tension that exists between our current reality and our aspirational future reality. And so this is, again, helping people move from seeing that there is a tension between how things are today and how we want things to be, and admitting that there's a gap and that we're not where we need to be, but we acknowledge that and we have a plan to move from here to there. So that, I think, is a really important role of leaders at all levels, to help change that negative connotation, that angst, from being something that can be kind of dampening and depressing to something that's full of possibility and hope. This concept of dynamic tension being a force that we can tap into to help pull us into a better future version of ourselves. So that's the second thing I think leaders can do. And then finally, number 3 is moving from us versus them to we're all in this together. So it's human nature, as I said, this is a concept that Yuval Noah Harari talks about in Sapiens, to define boundaries within our communities. I think the ideal number that humans kind of form and assemble into is about 150 people. And beyond that, it gets really hard to manage relationships. And so there's always a natural kind of grouping and just bounding ourselves from other groups with this notion. And for me, during my corporate career and my time as a manager, I think one of the most important things I did during my time as a manager was bringing people together, reaching upstream, reaching downstream to our partner organizations that were usually just a name on an email. There was no face to associate with those names. They were just people that we threw work over the fence to and hoped that they caught it. So this notion of bringing people together, putting a face to the name, we're all human beings, we're all in this together. Let's get everyone in a room and connect, build relationships, move from that us versus them to we're all in this together. And that helps alleviate the us versus them mentality, which is so pervasive and so instinctive to us human beings. So those are some of my reflections that I'd like to share with you today, this notion of cultural angst. I'm very curious, how does cultural angst show up for you in your workplace? Does this tension exist inside you or on your teams? And if so, how do you address it, or what ways do you have for working through this to turn it into a force that's powerful and positive? I would love to hear from you. And that is our special edition of the CatNip Show from Southern California. Thank you for listening in. I'd love to hear from you. Have a good rest of your day.